Hey, all my wonderful DIY home buying friends. Today we are tackling the $1,000,000 question, or perhaps it's a several $100,000 question. Regardless, the question is, how much home can you actually afford? And we're going to break it down by salary, talk about some things that you should keep in mind as you're considering home affordability, and if you stick around to the very end, we'll talk about how much money you would need to make in order to afford a wonderful mansion like Michael Jordan's. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Before we hit the numbers, let's go ahead and cover the basics. And we're going to be talking about some of the underlying assumptions that I'm using in calculating out how much home you can actually afford. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is 2836 rule. This is a principle that most lenders will use, at least roughly, as they're qualifying you for how much home you can actually afford. Now, the 28% rule is pretty simple. This is where they take a look at your gross income, that is all the money that you make monthly or yearly, and they say housing should account for no more than 28% of your total gross income. And the 36% rule is very similar. With the 36% rule, though, instead of just looking at your housing, they look at all of your debt obligations. That can be things like student loans, auto loans, credit cards, or any other debts that you have outstanding. And the lender wants to see that ideally your total debt obligation does not exceed 36% of how much money you bring in every month. Now, because in this video we're talking mostly about housing, it's the 28% rule that we're going to focus on the most, but that 36% rule is something that's very important to consider as well. So when you're thinking about your housing affordability, you need to look at all factors like how much are you spending for your student debts or for car payments or any other outstanding debts. Those are things that you're going to want to figure out. But assuming that you really don't have any other consumer debt, we're going to roll with that 28% rule, see how much you can afford. The 28% rule is pretty easy to calculate. We'll use simple numbers for the video here, but let's just say that before taxes, you're making $10,000 a month or $120,000 a year. Well, pretty easy to figure out. 28% of $10,000 a month is $2,800 a month, and this is how much you can safely assume you can afford towards your mortgage. Now, that mortgage is inclusive of principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. PITI is the acronym that we use, and that's kind of your all-in, highly predictable monthly payment towards your house. So with that $2,800 figure in mind, we're going to look at how much home you can afford based upon your salary. Before we turn that page, though, there's a couple of other assumptions that I've got at play. Now, of course, I'm filming this in September of 2024, where right now the average rate for a 30-year conventional loan for somebody that's got excellent credit, which is like a 740 and above, as well as that's coming in with a 20% down payment, you're looking at about a 6% interest rate. Some will get it a little bit lower, some will get it a bit higher, and the thing is that interest rates are always in flux. But that's an important assumption to be aware of as I'm calculating these numbers out. So, assuming that you get a 6% interest rate over a 30-year mortgage and you're putting 20% down, here is how much home you can reasonably afford based upon your salary. If you're making $50,000 a year, you could afford a $186,000 home. If you're making $75,000 a year, you could afford a $279,000 home. If you're making $100,000 a year, you can afford a $372,000 home. If you're making $150,000 a year, you could afford a $588,000 home. Making $200,000 a year, you could afford a $744,000 home. If you're making $300,000 a year, you could afford a $1,166,000 home. At $500,000 a year, you could comfortably afford a home that's $1,860,000. And for you high rollers making $1 million a year, well, you could afford a $3,720,000 home comfortably. Now that we've seen those numbers, let's talk about a handful of other factors you should consider when you're thinking about how much home you can comfortably afford. As I alluded to earlier, your credit score will have a large impact on your interest rate, and there's nothing that impacts housing affordability quite as much as interest rates do. And as you imagine, higher interest scores are going to qualify you for the lowest interest rates because with a high credit score, the bank views you as somebody who is very low risk to lend to. So to really maximize your housing affordability, it really does benefit you to get your credit score as high as possible before you start the home shopping process in earnest. Your debt to income ratio is another very important factor, both in what kind of interest rate you get, as well as how much home you can actually qualify for. This is where we come back to that 36% rule, because again, if you're making $10,000 a month, based on the 36% rule, lenders don't want you spending more than $3,600 a month total in your debt obligations. That includes your mortgage. So if you have a lot of debts, like $1,000 a month towards student loans, another $1,000 a month towards auto loans, and let's say that you've got $500 a month towards credit. Now, of that $3,600 a month that the bank sees you as reasonably being able to take on for your monthly debt obligations, $2,500 of that is already spoken for, which doesn't leave a whole lot left over for housing. So reducing your debts compared to your incomes will also go a long way, both in how much home you can afford and qualify for, as well as getting you a better interest rate. When you have a lower debt to income ratio, you qualify again for better rates, and better rates mean more housing affordability. The next factor to consider is your down payment. And as I mentioned, we assumed a 20% down payment here, but if you're putting down less, well, that's also going to reduce how much home you can afford. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is because obviously you're taking on a larger debt, which means that you can get less of a total purchase price home because your debt obligation is now going to be higher to pay off that loan balance. Secondly, when you put down less than 20%, you typically have to pay mortgage insurance, also called PMI. And PMI can add several $100s a month to your mortgage expense, further reducing how much home you can afford. And finally, typically the best interest rates are reserved for those who are putting down 20% or more on their home. If you put down less, the bank looks at it as a more risky loan, and usually they charge you a little bit higher interest rate. Of course, the inverse to all of this is also true. If you're putting down 50% or 70%, well, then the numbers of what you can afford in terms of monthly payments towards a house, well, that just goes way up in terms of the house that you can actually afford. So if you're coming in with a much larger down payment, then of course you can afford a much more expensive home than what I've shown in the video. And finally, we have to consider location. Real estate is all about location, and not all areas are created equal when it comes to property taxes. So in areas where property taxes are really high, obviously that's going to impact the total dollar amount of how much home you can reasonably afford. So to get the most for your money when it comes to housing, you want to find an area that has lower property taxes in general. Of course, this is all in an ideal world, an ideal scenario. There's a lot of factors that aren't accounted for that you as a potential homeowner should be aware of. The biggest one is home maintenance. Now, there's a few different ways to think about home maintenance. Usually you either want to calculate it based on 1% of the total value of the home is what you should account for in home maintenance, or $1 per square foot. I say to be conservative, you should go with whichever number is greater. So if you're buying a $1 million home, well, 1% of that is $10,000. You should be setting aside $10,000 a year to cover maintenance that comes up, just routine things related to the home, maybe more if it's a really unique property. Or if, let's just say you're buying a $300,000 home, but it's 4,000 square feet, well, in that case, I would recommend setting aside $4,000 a year for annual maintenance and those kinds of things. Just keep up on the house. Go with whatever number is greater. Also, if you're finding a 4,000 square foot home for $300,000, please let me know. I would be very fascinated to hear what markets those still exist in. You're also going to want to consider the cost of utilities. These can typically be a lot higher if the home is older or if it's a much larger home and you've got a lot more space to heat or to cool. Also, if you're running older lights, older appliances, you can have higher energy bills for those kinds of things. That's another factor you'll want to consider in your overall picture of housing affordability. A third factor to keep in mind are HOA fees. Really depends on the community. HOA fees can be as minimal as $20 a quarter, all the way up to several $1,000s a month. It's a wide range, and clearly that's going to have a massive impact on monthly affordability for the home as well. So do know if the community that you're looking at buying in has an HOA, and if so, what those fees are. Now, another thing that often buyers don't account for is furniture and decor. When you move, when you get into a new space, well, you're gonna wanna furnish it. And oftentimes you find that stuff that was in your old apartment or your old home, just not gonna cut it for that brand new spot. So do set some money aside. There's going to be some furnishing and decor that you're gonna wanna pick up. And finally, there can be the sneaky closing costs. And this is something that everyone should be accounting for. Often they're 1 to 3% of the total purchase price of the house. This is in addition to the down payment that you're bringing. So make sure that you've got money that is set aside for closing costs. Try not to roll those into your mortgage, because then you're just paying for those with interest, and it does hurt your monthly affordability. Now, I know I've thrown a lot of numbers at you, but not to worry. There's so many wonderful tools out there to help you figure out how much home you can reasonably afford. There are online mortgage calculators on sites like Zillow or Realtor.com or NerdWallet. Those are some places that I'd recommend going. There's also some great budgeting apps like Mint.com or You Need a Budget. Recommend using these if you really want to get a good look at what your total monthly debt obligations are. And then talk with your lender. Lenders, local credit unions, these can be wonderful resources to help you figure out just how much you can reasonably afford, taking a look at your total financial picture. Make sure you're not just looking at things as they currently are, but consider your future goals as well. How much do you want to be setting aside for savings and for investing, and what kind of vacations and things do you want to go on? Make sure that you have margin to do all the things that you want in life so that you don't become house poor. Now, before we go, let's talk about Michael Jordan's home and how much money you would need to be making every month in order to reasonably afford it, using our 28% rule, assuming that 20% down payment with a 6% interest rate. You ready for it? So, to afford a home that's $16 million, that's what Michael Jordan's latest mansion was listed at about the time it went pending, well, you would need a down payment of $3,200,000, which would leave you with a loan for $12,800,000. Your monthly mortgage payment would be $76,742 every month, which would require a monthly income of roughly $274,000, or an annual income of roughly $3,300,000, which makes sense of why somebody like Michael Jordan can easily afford that. So if you're a professional athlete, hey, Michael Jordan's home, it's available, and I might even be able to help you buy it. So I trust that all of this is interesting and helpful to you. Let me know in the comments below what questions you still have about housing affordability. Make sure you also like and subscribe to this channel. Share it with a friend so that they have an idea of how much they can reasonably afford too.